Hello, beautiful people. Engagement looks good on you. Thanks for joining us in our weekly show about politics. I am your host today, Carrie Eleveld. Marcos is out and about doing things, but I have a real treat for us here because, frankly, I know I would say little to nothing about rural America. And I mean, a little bit, but like really not much. And we have someone here today who is an expert in that. This is Matt Hildreth. He's executive director. Executive director. Oh, I regularly trip on introducing people. It's bad. But anyway, executive director of ruralorganizing.org. And he is treasurer of ruralvote.org. Okay. And they have been doing a lot of research. They've been organizing for years. How long has your organization been around, Matt?
We started as a network in 2012,
Okay.
and then we became an official organization in 2017.
Okay, great. So they have a progressive bent, right? And they're trying. I mean, I've talked to Matt a number of times. People who are avid listeners have heard him come on before. He always shares great information. They are, in some ways, some of their goals in these areas of the country is to help Democrats lose less rather than to help them necessarily win certain seats. I mean, there are some places, and we'll get into that, but they are, experts in best practices is how I would put it, into how Democrats can reach the voters in areas where Democrats simply, haven't played as heavily as they do in urban and suburban areas of the country. So anyway, Matt, thank you for joining us. We really appreciate having you.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I always love coming on your show.
All right, great. So I also want to let people know that we pre-recorded this because we have some upcoming summer vacations and things like that. So we pre-recorded this on June 7th, which means if there is some major rural development between now and then, we might not have it. But what we do know as of the time of this recording is that Trump is still a convicted felon. So, I mean, and the other thing we know is that Republicans are still, rabidly trying to regulate and restrict abortion access, contraception access, and reproductive freedoms across the country. Those two things have not changed. So we are going to go ahead. We're going to get you some information here. I know, let's talk first. Let's talk first about this. Well, let me ask you, let me start out with a broad question, Matt.
Sure.
We need to reach rural voters, but is it possible? I mean, that is like, I think Democrats in their heads are like, can we really get to them? So what's your take on this?
Yeah, well, I think that's actually a really good place to start, because I think when people hear rural, they think a lot of different things. And a lot of times it comes from their own personal experience of being in small towns and rural communities. And that experience can be very different from people across the spectrum for many different reasons. There's a lot of really progressive small towns and rural communities. Our slogan when we started our organization was boldly progressive, proudly rural. And we really wanted to lean into the fact that you don't have to choose between being a progressive person and a rural person, that you can have both identities, and that those identities don't necessarily conflict with each other. But some people have had bad experiences in small towns and rural communities. And, we've seen reports from places like the Trevor Project that queer youth are experiencing higher levels of bullying in small towns and rural communities. And so depending on what your perspective is, where you're coming from, you can have a very different idea about what political engagement should look like in rural America. What we think when we look at this is that we should start with the people who are first with us. And what people often miss is that rural does not just mean white conservative men to start. There are people in rural America that represent all different communities, just like in urban areas. Rural America is whiter than the urban metro America as a whole, but still 20% of rural Americans are people of color. And the fact is that as campaigns have changed over the last few years, it's gotten harder and harder to reach outside of what have become smaller Democratic bubbles. Politics has gotten more and more professionalized. And so it feels like if you don't know how to run some sort of advanced voter mobilization app, if you don't know how to cut turf, if you don't know how to use the latest talking points, it kind of feels like there's not space for you in campaigns anymore. So if you're living in a small town, you're a progressive Democrat, you recognize the long history of progressive policies in rural America that frankly started with the New Deal and built, progressive policies from FDR built the golden age of rural America. You recognize all that and you want to get involved in politics. Oftentimes, there's nowhere for you to go. And if you go to the local county Democrats and they're doing something, you're probably calling into more urban communities as a volunteer if you're doing phone banking. And so all of the focus has gone away from just reaching people where they are, mobilizing everyday people to reach their friends, families, and neighbors, and has focused in on, a smaller spectrum of counties and a wider spectrum of voters in those counties. So what's happening is that we are focusing more and more on soft and weak Republicans in metro counties before we even think about the base in more rural counties. And a lot of that's because people think it's hard to knock doors and actually reach people in rural America. But that's why we're so focused on coming up with strategies that are scalable, that can be taken into places outside the city limit sign.
Yeah, I just want to repeat back something that a point that you made there, which is really interesting, and it's something that is in this strategy memo that you guys put out a couple weeks ago, based on field experiments over the past 6 months in rural areas of the country. Specifically, I think you were in Ohio, maybe Michigan.
And
Is that right?
Montana. Yep, and Montana.
Montana.
Yep, our super
Okay.
PAC put it out.
So
So ruralvote.org /our strategy.
slash our strategy. So I am looking at this chart, and this just, again, you made this point, but I just want to emphasize it. It shows how much traditional Democratic campaign targets certain partisans, right? And so it targets in this graphic, it shows that traditional Democratic campaigns are targeting urban Democrats and then some like sort of maybe softer urban Republicans before they're even going into rural areas to find the Democrats in those areas who would already be with them. So, in other words, the strategy is, well, let's aim to win over some of the Republicans in urban areas rather than going out to rural America and aiming to get some voters who are already with us, to the polls, etc. So, I think so. You talked just a little bit about this, but I think on one level, it's like, well, how do we reach these people efficiently, right? If you have a canvassing campaign in rural America, it's not super efficient, right? You just go, if you go out in a suburbia, right, is like a great door knocking situation, because you just go house to house to house to house to house, and among those houses are a number of like swing voters, highly educated voters, etc. And it's kind of like custom made for, we're going to try to win over maybe some swingier independent voters who are relatively engaged, right? But so there's the efficiency problem, but there's also the messaging problem. um, what kind of messages work with rural voters? And I would say both those who might be on the fence about who they're going to vote for, but also those Democrats who are Democratic leaners who are on the fence about even going to the polls. Like, what kind of things are you saying to them, or how are you trying to reach them with a message about getting to the polls and then voting Democrat once they get there?
Yeah, absolutely. If you've knocked on doors for candidates or for Indivisible or for an advocacy group, you know that like a good day is when you are doing turnout they call it a turnout universe. When you're going and talking to Democrats about getting out to vote, because you knock on their door and people are like, oh, you're a Democrat. I'm a Democrat. We should all, let's all, have a conversation about how much we hate Donald Trump. And then, I'll remind you to go vote. And you say, oh, thanks for the reminder. I forgot that, the election was coming up, or I haven't made a plan to vote yet. Those are great conversations to have. The bad days are when you have to have persuasion conversations. And those are the conversations where you have to knock on doors. You don't know what the person's going to think before you knock on the door. You knock, and most often in rural America, they're like, oh, you're with the Democrats, get off my porch, right? And then you realize, okay, this person is not persuadable. Every once in a while, you get somebody that's like, oh, I haven't really thought about it. I haven't really paid attention to it. But as a canvasser, when you're knocking on those doors, even as a volunteer, that you can't make conclusions about that community based on your experience at the door, because you have a campaign director or a campaign manager back in the office going through the voter file and identifying people based on data who they think are somebody that needs to turn out to vote, or somebody that's persuadable. So that question of, are we turning people out or are we trying to persuade them, is something that people who knock on doors know very well. They also know what you just mentioned, is that there are walkable districts and not walkable districts. When I knock on doors, whether it's in a city or a small town rural community, I love getting apartment complexes that have exterior doors, because you can knock on 20 doors. You can walk up a few steps, knock, talk to somebody, walk down a few steps, walk up a few steps, knock, and you can knock out 60, 70 conversations in one apartment complex. That's amazing. In smaller towns, rural communities, the exurbs, the area outside of the suburbs, it can be harder. You might have to walk several feet, maybe several blocks before you get to the next house. Maybe you even have to drive. And those are all factors that a campaign manager has to consider. How walkable is it? How persuadable is the demographic? And I think that's where we are missing a lot of the strategy as Democrats. We've sort of now, know that we have to engage rural voters, but it's like, okay, what does the process actually look like? We think that we should be talking to as many Democrats in as many places as possible. And we have to find a way to go from having big online email lists to offline engagement in our communities. We've done things in the past around, house parties. We've done things in the past around organizing pods of volunteers to kind of do their own engagement. The Obama campaign in 2008 was amazing at this. People forget that Obama was the most popular candidate in terms of voters in rural America that we've seen in our lifetime. Barack Obama got more votes. The percentages change depending on how well the Republican does, but Obama got more votes in rural America than anybody, I think, in the last 20 some years. And that's because
super interesting.
They were actually organizing people in these communities, and they empowered them to engage kind of on their own terms. So that's what we've been really looking at. And we've been focusing on yard signs, because what we find is that if you think you're the only Democrat in a small town or rural community, it's really hard to get involved in politics. But if you see a yard sign pop up, and maybe it's in a house you kind of assume they were Democrats, but you didn't know it, or you see one that you wouldn't have expected, all of a sudden you think, you know what, I'm not alone, and we can do it. We can do this. And there are so many Democrats right now sitting on the sidelines in rural America, even in battleground states, because they think, I live in a county where 85% of my neighbors are Republicans. It doesn't matter what I do. It's never going to change. Well, what we're realizing is, if we can just move the margins by 5 percentage points in these rural areas, we can start winning again in statewide elections, or at least having a lot more safer margins, which I think having safer margins is getting more and more important in our democracy. We can have safer margins if we can start cutting some of these margins in rural areas. So we have to show people they're not alone. We have to show them that there's other Democrats in their communities. And we start first, we think, with the people who are with us, and we empower the people who are with us to engage their friends and family and neighbors, because we know the messenger always matters more than the message. And if somebody on TV is saying something, it doesn't really resonate with you. We find that what a candidate says about a community doesn't really matter. It doesn't really matter what Joe Biden says about rural America. It's what rural America says about Joe Biden. And if
Right.
you're out there in rural America and all you see is Trump signs, you're going to vote for Trump because you're going to feel like, you know what? It doesn't matter. I live in Trump country. This is
Or
just what we do.
not vote.
Or not
Yeah.
vote.
Right. I mean, so it's interesting because there's this old trope in that, I feel like yard signs become a topic of debate in almost like, every election at some point, like whether or not they matter. And there's always there's always some strategist on some side of the debate saying, well, yard signs don't vote. But it sounds like from your perspective in a rural area, they're actually even more important, particularly for Democrats, than they are just about anywhere else, because of the lack of community, the feeling of being isolated because everybody else is like a Trumper or a Republican. And, there's no, people need to feel a sense of solidarity. And in fact, I think that one of the reasons that MAGA has caught on so much is that people have just traded in identifying with other things that they may have used to have identified with, and just it's become a community for them. In MAGA America has become their sole source or their most prominent source of identification. And I feel like the hollowing out of a lot of rural communities, of small town communities, have left people without a sense of identity, without the Main Street identity that they have sometimes had. And so that's where sometimes, MAGA has sort of filled in for people. It's like, oh, I believe in this guy and I believe in this movement. I identify with it, right? And so it's sort of taken the place of some other pieces of community. And it sounds like, and even more isolated than are the Democrats and, other progressive or sort of, liberal leaning people who are in these places. Like they feel even more isolated because of that. And it sounds like, I think there's power in community and there's power in accountability around that community. It's like, a lot of times if you're like trying to get in shape or whatever,
Yeah.
you have buddies that you do it with, right? You have maybe a close friend, and like, did you do your 20 minutes on the bike today, or did you go for that walk or that run or whatever it might be? You have your friend, or you might have a family member that you're communicating with, whatever. I think people need that from a political standpoint too.
I think that's absolutely right. And I think one of the most interesting unaddressed questions in American politics is, why did Barack Obama do so well amongst rural voters? I mean, the reason why there are so many Obama Trump voters is because so many Republican counties in the Midwest, especially around the Mississippi River Valley, went for Obama for the first time for a Democrat in a generation. And so a lot of them, it's like, of course, it's not unexpected that they went back to a Republican, but we should have had a much longer conversation about why Obama won these counties than we did why did Trump win them back. Everybody wanted to talk about, oh, Trump tapped into something and he won them back. Yeah, that's interesting too, but like we never actually processed why Obama won them in the first time. And it was because he created that sense of community. And one of the other things that I think people get so wrong about politics is they think it's a zero-sum game, or they think it's a closed universe of voters. If you look at what happened in 2020, there were two essentially landslide elections that happened simultaneously. Joe Biden got more votes than anybody ever thought Joe Biden would get, and Donald Trump got more votes than anybody thought Donald Trump would get. And it happened at the same time. And because it's not like there's that many people out there saying, oh, I don't know what I think about Joe Biden, or I don't know what to think about Donald Trump. We know more about these two people than voters have known about presidents in the history of America. It's the
Right.
question that people have is, should I go vote? And does my vote matter? And that's where I think we're really losing people, especially in rural areas. And if you look at what the Democratic strategy has been in the last few years since Obama, it's a Joe Manchin strategy. And where is the community that Joe Manchin has created? Where is the sense of, we're getting screwed in West Virginia, which West
Mhm,
Virginians are getting screwed. And,
mhm.
Purdue farmers dumped all these pills into our communities. People are making millions off of these tragic stories of addiction. And we're going to hold them accountable. Joe Manchin didn't do anything around that. And Donald Trump did give people an out. And I don't mean to downplay the homophobia and the sexism and all the other stuff that is mobilizing MAGA. It is. There's no question about it. But there's this other group of people in these communities that don't have that sense of identity. They don't have that person who's talking to them saying, "Yeah, things are bad. You are getting screwed, and here's how we get out of it together." And
Right.
I also think one of the things people miss is like, I see Obama in these communities as like people trying to do it the nice way, right? Like, we're going to try it
Mhm.
the nice way first. And if being nice doesn't work, we're going to be mean and we're going to be evil and we're going to
Right.
right. And you look at like the hope and change versus fear and loathing, the hope and change out of Obama, and then the fear and loathing that came out of Trump. I think a lot of people really wanted to give the hope and change a chance. They didn't see any real difference in their community. And then Trump came in and said, "You tried being nice. Now let's be a bunch of assholes."
Right. Right.
And that is,
So
I
it's
think that's where the identity has gone, frankly.
the hope, right? The hope primed people for something that they ended up not feeling. So they felt the hope, but not the change. And then, they're in sort of a foul mood. You know what I mean? So
Yeah.
I think that's probably an oversimplification, but still not a bad framework for thinking about it. So
And I
let's,
think just
yeah,
just real
sorry.
quick on that, because I don't want to say that that's for everybody. The racism and the white rural rage that we see in these places, we see it. The people in our communities are oftentimes the first ones that feel that rage. I do think though, when you look at the margins, that there are people on the margins that aren't really in for all the mega stuff, but they
Mhm.
just don't feel the inspiration from the Joe Manchins, and they've
Right,
just kind of left going with the crowd because that's what everybody does. And I think that's where
right,
those margins really matter.
right. So what real quick, what do you tell people if they're like, yeah, okay, so you knock on their door and they say, yeah, I mean, I don't like Trump. I'm not going to vote for that guy. But like, does it even matter if I go to the polls? Like, I'm not super inspired by Joe Biden. I don't have I don't have a local race where I think we have a chance. Like, why does it even matter? What do you tell them?
So for me, the biggest issue is um, figuring out what's the popular message and what's the persuasive message. Too often we've confused a popular message for a persuasive message. And I think we saw this a lot in 2022. In 2022, all of the political strategists were saying, talk about the economy and jobs because that's what's most popular. That's what, when you poll on an issue and you say, do you agree or disagree with this statement? People would always agree or disagree, or would always agree with an economic message. But that doesn't mean that they then are going to go and do what you want them to do, vote for Democrats. A lot of people are saying, I love your economic message. That's why I'm voting for Donald Trump. And that, I think, is one of our biggest challenges, is like, okay, it doesn't really matter if a message is popular. We 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 need a message that is actually moving people. And when we look at what's actually moving people, it's a message around abortion. And that is where there's the clearest line and the clearest distinction between what the different parties are standing for right now. We can talk about the economy. We can talk about jobs. People will say, I agree with you. But then you get into a fight about, are the Democrats or Republicans going to be the ones that can really deliver jobs into rural America? I know it's the Democrats. I have no doubt about that. But when you look at abortion and you look at the number of people that support abortion rights in rural America, it's 20 to 50, it's 15 to 20 points higher than the number of people voting for Democrats. And there's no way to have a conversation with people about abortion rights that ends in confusion about which party stands where. I mean, look at what Republicans are doing on contraception. You look at what they're doing around, on Roe v. Wade, and voters know, right? They know what Republicans want to do on abortion, and they know that how they vote has a direct impact on who is in power and what those people will do when they're in power on abortion. So the economy, I think, is a much harder message to engage on. There's other issues around so much of the Biden administration's agenda around spending with green energy and the COVID relief programs, so much of that money is being allocated to Republican governors and Republican county commissioners who see a political incentive to not engage in those programs. We saw that with Obamacare, Medicaid expansion, where people wanted to blame Obama for healthcare issues that came from the Republican governors not engaging in Obamacare. We're seeing that with so much of the Biden, Build Back Better agenda, where Republicans are sabotaging these programs at the state and local level, and then saying, "See, the programs suck. Nothing ever gets better." So, abortion is such a clear message right now. I'm really happy to see Democrats leaning into that, and I think that we've gotten past the days where people feel like they can't talk about abortion in rural America, because we've seen so many elections and so many ballot initiatives where abortion has won amongst the majority of rural voters when Democrats
Yeah,
frankly have
that's
lost.
Yeah, that's great. I mean, the not the Democrats losing part, but it's great that that this has become, such a big issue that Democrats can run on, and that they're running on it, particularly in rural America. It's amazing because really, before Dobbs, the Democratic line was, let's not lean into abortion. It's not popular. So it seems that we've gotten over that hump. Do you think Democrats, like, is the Biden campaign or is the DNC, are they doing a good job of leveraging the issue?
I think so. I really do. And I think, you know, that it's funny how bad polling can connect so quickly to bad strategy. And a lot of the polling that we saw going back to 2014, 2015 on abortion would ask the question, are you pro-life or pro-choice? That is such that's a difficult question for a lot of people to answer. And
Mhm.
there's not a lot of policy questions you can take from that. We saw from the beginning that if you ask the question, do you think abortion should be legal or illegal? People wanted to keep abortion legal. And there was this perception that, we were being dramatic when we would say Republicans want to take away your abortion rights. People would say Roe v. Wade is settled law. We're not going to do it. I mean, we saw that during the Kavanaugh hearings. And so there was just a lot of confusion and disinformation back then. Now it is so clear. And I think Democrats have done a much better job. And I give a ton of credit to the organizers in Kansas. I think after the Kansas abortion ballot initiative, people just sort of woke up to it and said, "Oh, maybe there's something here." I grew up in South Dakota. In South Dakota, I've seen polling where it's just been so clear that South Dakotans support abortion rights. And it was always such a fight in the past. So I think Democrats have stepped into it. One of the things that I've noticed, and I think we have to be really careful with it, and I think that's why the Republican votes on contraception are so important, is that I worry that in red states where we have, like in Ohio, where you have state abortion ballots addressing the issue at the state level, voters will feel like, okay, I'm safe now. We took care of it here. It was a federal law. Now we've solved it at the state level. I can go back to voting however I want to vote on other issues. And I think Democrats have done a good job of reminding people what the national agenda is, and that Republicans aren't going to stop with just Roe v. Wade. So I think that that's where I'm seeing people step in a lot more. And, if you look at the map where abortion is still being decided at the state level, and then you overlay that with the battleground maps, there's a lot of places in the battleground states where, it's been sort of resolved by the state constitutions. And that's why I think the
But
federally Democrats have to keep on the message and remind people what the Republican agenda is, because I think people might think it's been solved when it really has not.
sure, two things on that. Okay, we saw sort of a lack of engagement to some extent in the midterms in places like New York and California. I think part from with voters, right? And so we lost some House seats there. And I think people they hadn't quite connected the dots on how, even though they were in a blue state, that actually abortion rights were at risk, and very much are at risk, because it doesn't matter how blue a state you live in if Republicans end up with control of Congress and the White House. Like, it just doesn't matter. They not only can, they will, at the fastest moment possible, they will sprint to passing a national abortion ban and putting it on Trump's desk. I guarantee you, as soon as they think they have the votes in line, they will do it immediately. Just like the Supreme Court ran to doing that as fast as it could once they had the votes to overturn Roe v. Wade. So, but what do you think about? Look, we're going to have. It looks like a measure in Arizona, a abortion rights ballot measure in Arizona, in Florida, and probably in Montana. Am I wrong about that? Are there other areas where you think that? I mean, how do you think that helps you?
Those are the ones we're watching. We definitely think so. In Montana right now, through our yard sign campaign, it's all online to offline focus. So it starts with just people getting a text saying, "Hey, I'm Matt with RealVote.org, and we are handing out free yard signs in battleground states for anybody that supports democratic values and democratic candidates." And from there, people sort of think, "Hey, this is probably a scam or whatever." But but enough people respond and say, "Yeah, I'll take a free sign." Well, when they get a sign, what the sign says is, "We support freedom and choice, or choice and freedom." And when you look at the type of people that are engaging right now in Montana, it really is on abortion rights for our base. When we get into later into the cycle, our signs are going to obviously support Tester as well. But when it comes to really communicating those values, that is something that I think people feel very much are under attack. With Arizona and Florida, those are the places where you have the overlap with battleground states and abortion rights on the ballot in the state elections. I think those are the ones where we have to go all in. And I think that in places like Arizona, especially, margins are going to matter, and it makes a difference if we win by 3 points. It makes a difference if we win by 4 points. I mean, and same with House elections in New York and in California. We have to have a strong showing this year more than any others, because we know that any place it's going to be close. They are going to do everything they can to attack it. And like you said, even if we are solving these things on the state ballots, federally, there are, we cannot compare a Trump second term to a Trump first term. They are fundamentally different things. They didn't know what they were doing in their first term. So thinking, "Oh, you know what? I'm not that happy with Joe Biden. I'm not that happy with Democrats, but we made it through the first term, so we can make it through the second term." I think that is going to be a fatal mistake if we think that, because there are people right now that are learning from how they failed in the last administration. The number one thing they're going to focus on is loyalty, and there is going to be no breaks. And if we need to have every member in the House we can to stop it, we need to have every senator that we can to stop it, and we need to have the strongest showing that we can in all of these places, where Democrats always kind of won. So why show up? I think it's going to have to be a year where everybody has to turn out.
Right. And then in places, to your point, where, someone like John Tester or Sherrod Brown, right, in Ohio, or Ruben Gallego in Arizona, but where, it seemed they have a strong, those candidates, incumbents, but the two of them, sorry, are, have a strong brand, but like those are going to be some tough races, and those two races, those three races. I mean, there's like a handful of states, right, that are just going to absolutely decide who is in control of the Senate. And then you can look at those more progressive areas. We've talked about those House districts in California and New York, and that could very much decide what happens in the House, right? Democrats just desperately need to retake the House. And there is a path. It is narrow, but there is a path to us, keeping the Senate. And it frankly runs through the White House. Like we're probably going to end up, I mean, what we probably have is a scenario with if Democrats are able to keep it, is a scenario with a 50-50. And then Kamala Harris, or the vice president, right, being the tie-breaking vote, hopefully a Democrat, right? Let me ask you one more question, and then I think we're gonna move along here so that people can get on with their days. But we appreciate you guys listening. This has been fascinating. I think your yard sign strategy is super interesting. And I love your engagement strategy, right? You start out, it's like, here they get a text message, and then you get a little bit of buy-in, and then before, it goes from the online to the offline, which is great. Who do you think, is there a candidate right now who you think is doing it right? Like, who do you, I mean, I'm not saying that there aren't, that this is the only candidate, but if you had to choose a candidate who you're like, I really think this person has their finger on the pulse of how to message and engage with rural America, who do you think it would be?
Yeah, so the candidate that I think has the best understanding of rural America is Sherrod Brown. I think Sherrod Brown, I mean, since the beginning, has fought for working class people. He wears the canary on his lapel pin for the coal miners, and gets the idea of the dignity of work, I think, better than just about any other Democrat. And so, I'm super excited that we're incorporated in Ohio. I started the organization while I was living in Ohio, and I've always been just a huge fan of his. And the other thing is he doesn't compromise on progressive values either. And he also understands the feeling that people have about getting screwed. So the position on the banking committee is absolutely critical. So from both a campaign and from a policy perspective, really, I'm a big fan of his. Governor Evers in Wisconsin has done amazing work around the Office of Rural Prosperity in Wisconsin. I do think policy still matters, but people have to feel it in their communities. And so often it's the red state governors that are preventing any of this federal funding from having an impact. But if you look at how Governor Evers has leveraged the work that the Biden administration is doing to have a state impact, I think it's just been fantastic. In terms of campaign strategy, Governor Shapiro in Pennsylvania has had a higher performance in the greater Pennsylvania community than I think just about any other candidate in over 50 years. Governor Shapiro actually gave out free yard signs to anybody who requested them on his website, which I love personally because I think that stuff matters. But if you look at his margins, I think that's another really unreported story, is just how well he did. Even when you compare him to Fetterman, Shapiro was just way more popular in rural areas. And I think a lot of that has to do with just really smart campaign strategy.
Yeah. Yeah. I remember hearing him say, I just believe in going out and talking to people everywhere. I don't care where it is. I talk to people everywhere. So I'm assuming
Yeah.
that he hit, every county,
And
every district,
and
et
he
cetera.
and
Yeah.
he knows it's true. And this is what we see, that it doesn't matter what he says to rural Pennsylvania. It's what rural Pennsylvania says about him. And that's where
Right.
those yard signs can really show that rural Pennsylvania supported him. And I think that's why we saw his margins go up so much, even when somebody like Fetterman also was saying similar things about going everywhere. It's just Shapiro had this ability to do it, I think, from a campaign strategy perspective, not just from a rhetoric perspective.
Right. Right. Okay. Listen, thanks so much, Matt Hildreth from ruralorganizing.org. Matt, where can people find you? Where can people potentially donate or get involved?
Yep. So ruralorganizing.org is our primary website. Most of the work that we do throughout the year is done through there. Right now, we have a survey on the homepage at ruralorganizing.org asking people about their experience in rural communities and what they need help with. So especially for anybody that's in a rural area and wants to make a difference, go to ruralorganizing.org, fill out that survey, and we'll follow up. And then in terms of the political work, every dollar that goes into ruralvote.org, which is our super PAC, is spent on politics. And so our focus is getting Democratic visibility into rural America. So if you really want your dollars to go to that, go to ruralvote.org, and there's a donate button, and we would appreciate it.
All right. Sounds great. All right. Thank you so much, Matt. Appreciate having you as always. Thank you to our listeners. We love having you. You're so important. Everyone's engagement in the issues and whatever moves you, whatever you feel inspired or personally committed to, whether it's a race or a message or whatever, please engage. This is, once again, the most important, election of our lifetimes. And we can do this. We get to write this history. We are the best messengers there are. We're better messengers than anybody else, bar none, with our peer group, with our neighbors and friends and family. And also thank you to Walter, our producer, who helps out behind the scenes. And we will see you soon. Remember, we recorded this on June 7th. It's going to run a couple weeks from now, but we will be back in July. So we will talk to you then. Thanks for joining us.